live. Welcome back to episode number 9 of Calibrated with Scott. I'm Scott. I get to say it today. I'm Scott, not Ritter. It's a common joke on our Telegram channel because everybody seems to think that I'm Scott Ritter. I am not. I am just Scott, but I am joined today by Scott Ritter, and I'm overly joyed to have you on. How are you?
I'm doing great, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. It's fantastic to have you on. And I am joined today by my co-hosts, Alex and KSB. How are you guys doing today?
Doing great.
Oh well, it's a cold early Moscow morning, so let's talk some tactics.
I imagine you're freezing up there. All right, we should just get right into it. We have had a lot go down in Ukraine over the past couple of days. We've had a lot go down around the Western support for Ukraine. We have a lot of news to talk about. And first, I would like to talk about Solidar. We have had a Russian push through Solidar that I feel exposed a lot of Ukraine's weaknesses in this area in particular, and a lot of Russia's strengths. From the area of Solidar, Scott, where do you see the Russians now pushing and advancing, and where do you see the where would you put Russia's plans?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to point out that this offensive in the direction of Bakhmut has been ongoing since May. This isn't something new. Even during the Ukrainian counteroffensives of September, October, the attack in the direction of Bakhmut and Solidar never let up. So the reason why I bring that up is it's clear to me that this is a major axis of advance for the Russians, that the Russians have clear intent for this. There's a lot of naysayers out there saying that this meat grinder is a waste of lives and effort on the part of Russia. It's scoring cheap political talking points without any real military advantage. But I think the reality on the ground is far different. The twin pillars, so to speak, of Solidar and Bakhmut, defensive positions that are anchored by these salt mines that provide underground depth to what is one of the most extensive networks of fortifications seen in Europe in a long time. This is a critical logistical, command and control, and psychological piece of terrain for Ukraine, and Russia has, I think, solved the Gordian knot, so to speak, cut it with a sword. Solidar appears to have fallen. Bakhmut is being surrounded, at least by fire, if not physically. And I believe that when Bakhmut falls, that will be a precursor for the initiation of follow-on offensive military operations designed to roll up the Ukrainian defensive line in that sector and elsewhere to push deeper. I also believe that Bakhmut probably won't fall until Russia's ready to carry out those offensive operations. That I think you're going to see some battlefield management in terms of the timing of the advance. That what you don't want to do is create an opportunity at Bakhmut that Russia's not ready to exploit, because then what you do is you buy the Ukrainians time to readjust to the battlefield. So when the time comes for Bakhmut to fall, I believe that it'll be followed up with immediate offensive pressure designed to keep the Ukrainians on their back heel. And I think that's going to be Russia's goal all along, is to try and break the impasse, the status quo that currently exists along eastern Ukraine. And once they've broken free of the of these defensive positions, just to maintain consistent pressure and push the Ukrainians back, grind them down. The stated goal is the destruction, demilitarization, the destruction of the Ukrainian armed forces. And I think we're going to see a lot of that happening in the weeks and months to come.
Alex, you want to go ahead?
Yes. Of course, we've discussed the fact that the siege of Artyomovsk, Bakhmut, whichever you prefer, has been ongoing since sort of late spring, early summer. Could you hypothesize as to what caused this cardinal change in pace? We've seen it sort of progressively accelerating. There was a big, should we say, lurch at the beginning of autumn. Is there any particular sort of circumstances that could have led to that?
Well, first of all, I think there's just we have to acknowledge the incredible difficulty of attacking in this axis. One trench line after another with reinforced bunkers, defended by highly motivated, well-trained Ukrainian forces. At least, that was the case early on. It was just a tough nut to crack. I don't imagine that. I think Wagner has been in the forefront of the assault in this direction for some time. Of course, supported by DNR militia and then later Russian forces. But Wagner has been the critical force, and it hasn't been through a lack of trying that has kept this pace slow. It's just a very, very difficult task to carry out. The reduction of a fortified position. I remember my training in the Marine Corps. This is where the instructors went around and said, "You're dead, you're dead, you're dead, you're dead," because you just make mistakes, and when you make mistakes, you die. This is urban warfare. This is the reduction of fortified position. It's just a very difficult job to do. So I don't think it's that Russia was trying to be slow. I think one of the big concerns for Russia is casualties, and to carry out the operations that if you're not taking territory, at least you're reducing the enemy. You're killing them. You're grinding them down. I mean, the term meat grinder came into play well in this area well before its current popularity. We've seen the Russians favor artillery. Use artillery to reduce Ukrainian defenses and move in for the assault only after the Russians have created an environment that is conducive to, occupying territory with the minimum number of casualties. Russia has shown, I believe, a willingness to hold back and just continue to pound the position with artillery and make slow incremental advances in lieu of something that's dramatic, but you suffer, significant casualties. I always point out to people that, the SMO was started with, in the vicinity of 200,000 troops. It was peacetime footing. There was no wartime mobilization. Now, these 200,000 didn't include the DNR and LNR militias or Wagner or some of the volunteer units. But even when you add those up in the aggregate, you may get 80,000 additional forces. That's it, and you don't want to grind those down. You want to grind the other side down, and so I think the advance on the Soledar Bakhmut axis has been a very deliberate advance designed to maximize Ukrainian losses and minimize Russian losses.
You mentioned that during that when Bakhmut and Soledar are finally both taken, that we'll see Russian operations to kind of develop their offensive in the Donbass area. I'm reminded of when Popasnaya and Lysychansk were liberated. We saw briefly after that a kind of a mini thunder run where Russia was able to push its forces to the area near Siversk and Soledar and Bakhmut, but then it kind of died down. Activity just really slowed. Do you think now, with these newly trained, newly mobilized troops and this new equipment being flooded into the area, that'll be less of a problem in exploiting the gap in the defenses when Bakhmut's finally liberated?
I hope so. I mean, for the Russians' sake, that, and the reason why I say hope so, I'm supposed to be an impartial observer. It's tough for me to be impartial when I take a look at the ideology of Stepan Bandera that has infused Ukraine. It's very difficult for me to have any sympathy for a Ukrainian government that has embraced that, for an Ukrainian military that's absorbed units that are seeped in this odious ideology, and just the history of this conflict. I'm somebody who believes that Russia is on the right side of history here. So I do have a heavy Russian bias, and I think I need to be honest with that up front, but it doesn't color my analysis, meaning that I'm not blind to Russian mistakes. I'm not blind to Ukrainian when Ukraine is successful, I'm not going to pretend it didn't happen. You must be honest in your analysis. But I'm someone who believes that the sooner this war is over, the better off it will be for not just Ukraine and Russia, but all of Europe. And for this war to end, I believe it needs to end in a decisive Russian victory. So now that explains why I said I hope so, because the opportunities are going to emerge as Russia, pushes forward, not just in Bakhmut, Soledar, but in other areas as well. And when a gap appears in the Ukrainian lines, if Russia doesn't exploit that gap, Ukraine will have an opportunity to regroup, maybe fall back on prepared defensive positions and properly man them, and thereby create yet another obstacle breaching mission for Russia. And this can not only slow any momentum that might have accrued had Russia responded rapidly, but also increase the human and material cost to Russia. So when I take a look at certain things, I see, for instance, right now there's exercises ongoing in Belarus between the joint group of forces that have been created. These exercises, I believe, are scheduled to terminate on or about February 1st. I also see senior Russian officials who are responsible for mobilization saying that all resources need to be in the SMO area by February 1st. This tells me, I'm a simple Marine, but it tells me that maybe something's about to happen sometime after February 1st. And if the Russian, military planners are as good as their education potential suggests they will be, meaning people have gone to the staff college, they're well trained in military art. They know what they need to do. They know that they're going to accrue forces, and they know how to carry out an offense by the book. They know how to create a sequence of events that culminates in combat power being focused on a single point. They know how to have troops prepared to exploit. They've done this all in training, and I think they're going to get ready to execute it in reality. And the Ukrainian military is poorly positioned at this point in time to provide effective resistance. They have burned through much of the operational force that NATO had helped them build up over the course of the summer and fall. And whatever remained is getting ground down in the fighting in Soledar and Bakhmut and elsewhere. There are not significant Ukrainian reserves of high quality and high mobility to provide Ukraine with what I call the fire brigade capability. That is, to have an armored fist able to reach out and blunt any Russian breakthrough. So I think the Russians are well positioned to not only break through the Ukrainian defenses, but to launch an immediate exploitation of that attack that can be developed to Russia's singular advantage, simply because Ukraine lacks the resources at this point in time to respond effectively. Now, the longer Russia waits to launch this kind of offensive, the more time Ukraine will have to receive not only Western equipment, heavy weapons, but also tens of thousands of troops that are undergoing training in the West. And if you wait long enough, then you allow Ukraine to actually take this equipment married up with troops and create intact, brigade-sized combat forces that can, cause Russia problems. It doesn't mean that they're going to win, but it causes a problem. However, if Russia initiates an attack that preempts Ukraine's acquisition of this equipment and personnel, the momentum and mass of the Russian attack will mandate that Ukraine commit forces piecemeal. So they won't have a chance to accumulate forces in the relative safety of the rear and build up an armored core that can strike Russia. They will have to take battalions as they come in and throw them into the front lines, and Russia will be able to grind these up. And I think it's to Russia's advantage to initiate offensive operations soon, sustain these offensive operations to such an extent that Ukraine must burn through its reserves in a haphazard manner, which dilutes the impact I think the West intends to have by providing Ukraine with this heavy weaponry and providing training to people. If Ukraine is able to acquire, one or two division equivalents of mechanized armor, they could cause Russia problems. It doesn't mean they're going to win, but the Germans were able to punch America in the face at the Battle of the Bulge. We ended up winning, but we lost a lot of guys. It delayed things, and it wasn't pretty. And I don't think Russia wants to have down the road, a situation unfolding on the eastern Ukrainian front similar to the Battle of the Bulge, where the Ukrainians launch a massive counterattack that that pushes Russia back. I think the day of Russia being pushed back it should be over. There's no reason for it to occur if Russia, takes advantage of I believe all of the advantages that have accrued because of this mobilization, because of the grinding down of Ukrainian forces, and because, frankly speaking, of the delay and the hesitancy on the part of NATO and the United States to provide heavy weaponry that Ukraine's been saying they need for some time now. I mean, had the United States and NATO acted on this, say back in October, we could be looking at a different situation, but they didn't, and Ukraine's left hanging in the lurch.
I had a question sort of that tangentially relates to what you mentioned there. You spoke a little about the planners of the special military operation. We have seen a reshuffling of the command structure, sort of a more streamlining of it, I suppose. But the West has been positioning this as some utterly bogus sort of, Surovikin getting punished for this, that, and the other, or some sort of internal intrigue going on. I mean, I served in the Russian military. I dismiss these claims out of hand entirely. Like, we all serve the motherland. There can be no intrigue when the motherland is in danger. But sort of what do these reshufflings mean? What does Army General Gerasimov's personal command mean? And does this perhaps mean that we will see much larger scale operations, or perhaps a bombing campaign, now that the head of the aerospace forces has been freed up to micromanage his aerospace forces again?
Yeah, when the SMO started, there were, I believe, 4 distinct fronts, if we want to call them, that were basically managed independent of one another. This was phase 1. And at some point in time, when all this is said and done, we're going to find out what Russia's intent was for phase 1. I mean, there's a lot of speculation. I have my own opinion on what was going on, but we haven't received the full briefing as to why Russia did what it did in phase 1 to sortie forth columns with zero regard for flank and rear area security, allowing several of them to be ambushed and heavy casualties inflicted. Was this bad intelligence? Was this deceit? Was this poor planning? Who knows? But what we do know is that sometime in March, Russia made the decision to simplify the SMO operations withdrew from the Kiev area, from Sumy area, elsewhere, and solely focused on stabilizing the front in the Kherson Zaporizhia area and carrying out offensive operations to liberate Lugansk and Donetsk. And then the Ukrainians counterattacked. And when they counterattacked, they put the Russians back on their back feet. This created a unique military problem of a singular nature. And rather than to have competing military districts and such, the Russians placed this problem under the command of General Armageddon, General Surovikin. And I'm sure I just butchered that pronunciation, but forgive me. He did a fantastic job. I don't care who you are. When you inherit a problem such as he did, where Alex, you were in the military, and I'm assuming maybe other people were. I don't know, but the one of the most dangerous positions to be in is in a military that is either retreating or hastily withdrawing. Things are chaotic. Command and control is not at its ideal. Supporting fires have not been coordinated. There are potential gaps not only in the frontage, but also into the depth that can be exploited by a rapidly advancing enemy. And if left unattended, it could lead to panic and absolute collapse. And I'm not saying that Russia was in danger of this, but they were headed. The trajectory of the momentum was headed in the direction that the Russian high command didn't want. And General Surovikin came in and he stabilized the front. He made some very difficult decisions. He gave up territory he sacrificed territory to save lives. He consolidated the defensive line while awaiting the arrival of mobilized troops who could help, stiffen the defenses, all the while maintaining offensive operations in the Soledar-Bakhmut direction, by the way. That never stopped. And he also initiated a air campaign that had significant impact. He basically shut down Ukraine as a modern functioning state. And I think the combination of the air campaign together with his consolidation of Russian defenses, the maintenance of offensive operations in Bakhmut, bought Russia time. It put Ukraine back on its heels. I mean, the Ukrainians were beating themselves to death, banging their head against this brick wall that General Surovikin has created. But now the mobilization is reaching its end. You're going to have, I don't know the exact number, 80 to 90,000, maybe 100,000 mobilized troops were brought in to be absorbed in the front to create frontages that are manned appropriately, not only in terms of the length of the thing, but in terms of the depth doctrinally, artillery in place to actually carry out the kind of fire cauldrons that doctrine calls for if an enemy attacks and seeks to bypass, dug in battalion sized formations. They're boxed up in a pocket, they'll be pounded. And we saw this. We saw the Ukrainians repeatedly fall victim to doctrinal Russian defense. And it's very, very effective. And General Surovikin deserves all the credit in the world for this. But now the total mobilization is taking place. And it appears that Russia is not going to limit itself to simply carrying out an expansion of phase 2 operations. They have built this significant group of forces in Belarus, combined forces, Russian, Belarus. And whether they're going to be used or they're just there as a force in readiness, as a force to scare the Ukrainians, to intimidate the Poles, I don't know. But if you're going to build that force, you have to be prepared to use that force, which means you need a commander and a command staff capable of effectively employing that force. And that isn't going to happen with a command staff that's down in the southern area. General Surovikin could not do both at the same time. The air campaign looks like it's going to become very, very critical, not just for demilitarization, but I believe perhaps more importantly, denazification, which means that the destruction of the Ukrainian nation to make the current political leadership totally unviable, suitable for elimination from within, or self-retirement. But it will be done through air power, and the air campaign is going to become a major component. And again, now we've just described three things: the Eastern European or Eastern Ukrainian front existing that General Surovikin created, potential operations out of Belarus, and an air campaign. And now we add another front coming out of Belgorod. There appears to be a great grouping of forces there that gives the Russians significant strike capacity coming down from Sumy, threatening Kharkov, etc. So that's four major fronts. There may be more. I'm not on the Russian general staff. I don't know what big arrows are drawn on the map, but it looks like Russia's getting ready to fight a military campaign that's orders of magnitude more complicated than what General Surovikin was doing. Generals provide great leadership, but they're supported by their staffs, and staffs have limitations. General Surovikin's staff was not capable of doing everything that was described, but there was no shakeup. He still reported to Valery Gerasimov. It's not as though Gerasimov ceased to exist. Surovikin reported to him. What's happening now is the problem of this expanded special military operations / war is being pushed upstairs to General Gerasimov's level. The general staff now will have responsibility for overall direction of the conflict. And, I think we saw that, one of General Surovikin's fortes is, strategic air, combat. And he's being given responsibility for waging what I believe will be an independent strategic air campaign. This isn't a demotion. It's just taking your resources in an expanded war and putting them where they're most effective. And you'll see the other generals that are there were always there. They're just now bringing their staffs into play because war is all about staff work. I mean, we could talk about the heroism of people on the front line, and the guys you put the stars, the gold stars on their chest, or the St. George medals. That looks good on TV, but the guys that make it all work are the guys in the back, with the typewriters and the maps and such, who are drawing up the plans, doing the logistical support, providing communication support. This is all staff work. And this shakeup that's taken place simply is bringing in staffs appropriate to the task. It's not a sign of Russian collapse or intrigue. It's a sign of Russian professionalism.
Yeah, I think that pretty much anybody who has had any military experience or knows anything about militaries knows that leadership gets moved around whenever necessary, and it doesn't always necessarily mean a bad thing. KSB, did you have a question?
Well, I kind of wanted to shift gears a little. You talked about the meat grinder in Donbass for the Ukrainian forces, and that kind of brought a question to mind. Here in the United States, we're often taught to think of our defense industry as the same defense industry as in World War II, which was highly efficient, highly productive. And at the same time, we're taught to think of the Russian defense industry as being highly incompetent, inefficient, and unproductive. And yet in this war, we've really seen that it's the opposite that's true. That it's Russia that's able to pump out all of this equipment, all of these tanks and armored vehicles, and most importantly, ammunition. Can you explain a little why that is, and why the U.S. defense industry is just seemingly so far behind the Russian defense industry in terms of being able to produce critical equipment?
Well, I think let's focus on the U.S. defense industry first. When the Cold War ended, you know, the United States, there was this big push for a peace dividend, and so we, you know, sought a massive reduction in our military, and we, you know, at the same time we started cutting back on weapon systems and things of that nature, as we shrunk down. We retained some military capacity, but the way the United States works is we're not on a war footing. Um, we work on a budget. The budget is highly politicized, but you know, defense contractors can't produce something unless it's been budgeted for, allocated by Congress, um, and then, you know, that's how they gear up. And so there's big lead times required to get things produced in the United States. So we don't have a factory that's manned up with highly trained people with the resource base, the raw materials standing by at a moment's notice to say, resume production of the M1 tank. Um, it just doesn't work that way. We don't like to keep assembly lines idle, meaning if we're not using it, we lose it. It gets converted to produce something else so that the profit margin of the company is maintained. Um, and this works in peacetime, you know, because we're not at war. We spend a lot of money building sufficient, or what was sufficient capacity to deal with conflict on a large scale. But then 9/11 came, and we became singularly focused on, you know, low intensity combat, counterinsurgency warfare in Iraq, in Afghanistan. We stopped doing the you know, the development and training, most importantly the training, because training implies intent. Intent implies what you need to, you know, get from Congress, from the defense industry. And so we weren't training in large scale tank combat anymore. We weren't training with, you know, large amounts of artillery and, you know, aircraft that had to come in and penetrate enemy air defenses. That's what we did during the Cold War. We stopped doing that. We started training on, you know, how to deal with, you know, counterinsurgency efforts, et cetera. A different focus, different support requirements. And, you know, we saw the defense industry kick over into drone warfare, building drones, electronic warfare for better communications, not jamming, but better comms. You know, anti-mining, that we created a whole industry for demining, anti-mining, IED suppression, IED resistant vehicles, things of this nature. This is what we were focused on. And then when the global war on terror ended, you know, we didn't immediately transition our defense industry over to, you know, deal with Russia or China. It was a slow, gradual transition that still is incomplete to this day. So we're a prisoner of our own systemic shortcomings. You know, once we get things up and running, we do the research and development, we develop the technologies, we develop the industrial base, we get the funding, we can produce some of the world's best equipment. But it takes time. It takes a lot of time. Nothing happens instantaneously. Now we go to Russia. Russia inherited a massive, yet in many ways decrepit defense industry enterprise from the Soviet Union. And early on, the you know, the Russian budget was not designed to sustain a viable military on the scale that the Soviet Union had and support it through defense industry. If you take a look at the, you know, the orders that went out for different weapon systems, they, in many cases, they dropped to zero. In some cases, they just punched out one or two or three. But to Russia's credit, they didn't dismantle this defense industry establishment. They sustained it, and they, you know, we went away. Russia went away from the old, I call it the Vodkinsk model, you know, where because I was in Vodkinsk for a number of years doing weapons inspections, and the Vodkinsk Production Association sort of ran the city. It was the most important economic enterprise. Because all the money from building missiles came to them, they dispersed it to build the schools, to build the cultural centers, to pave the roads, to build stores, etc. These defense industry enterprises eventually became replaced by something they call joint stock associations. And I have to go in and take a look at the legalities of this, but it's sort of a combination of state defense industry with private, private interests. They've created this combination to make it more profitable. Because running a profitable industry is now important for Russia. The day of massive defense subsidies is over, but you still had these. The defense industry was surviving, but it was there. In 2008, because well, let's back up. The Soviet military, was unsustainable in terms of the size, the scope, the scale, and its organization was not something that Russia was able to underwrite. So you saw, for instance, that the Russians do away with Cold War era type formations. The First Guards Tank Army was dissolved. The 20th Combined Arms Army was dissolved. Divisions were de-emphasized. Brigades became the organizational structure of choice because Russia wasn't preparing to fight a large-scale land war in Europe. Russia was preparing to deal with smaller conflicts, for instance, like the Chechen conflict. 2008, I think, was a big wake-up call for Russia. The Russian-Georgian conflict. It was a short conflict, but the Russian army that was mobilized and put on the road was tactically inept. The communications weren't good. There were problems in leadership, coordination. But what they had is mass, and they were able to overwhelm what many Russian officers recognized as a superior, a Georgian army that had superior training and at the tactical level was outfighting the Russians. And this was a wake-up call because I think many Russian generals realized that if the Georgian military had been an actual NATO, military with the heavy equipment and all the support, that things may not have turned out the way that they did, that the Russian army could have been defeated decisively. And that's when the Russians began a program of modernizing and re-equipping their military. But now they have the defense industry that's there waiting for these orders to come in. And so as the Russian economy is improving, as energy is flowing, as money's coming in, Russia was able to allocate a budget sufficient to the task of, supporting this reorganization and re-equipping of the Russian military. And we saw the benefits of that in 2014 with the little green men and the professionalism of this new Russian army that was invigorated, breaking free of a primarily conscript force to one that placed heavy emphasis on contract soldiers, good equipment, good communications, and a structure that was conducive to modern war, and they just kept improving. In 2016, about that time, we saw the Russians bring back the First Guards Tank Army, the 20th Combined Arms Army, as Russia realized that the aggressive stance of NATO required a Russian military force capable of responding just in case. And so Russia started preparing for large-scale ground combat in Europe at a time when the United States was still chasing goat herders in Afghanistan and hunting down ISIS in Iraq as our primary focus of effort. So Russia's defense industry between 2008, 2016 is already fully engaged in the process of supplying this newly structured Russian military. And then we just see it continue this way. And now we take a look at President Putin has signed off on an order expanding the Russian military to 1.5 million. This requires the creation of whole new units that have to be equipped at the same time that he is, supporting a conflict in Ukraine that is, has its own intensive logistical support required. And Russian defense industry is right there, not even blinking. They're able to receive the orders, adapt to the orders, produce the equipment, because they have been in a warlike footing since 2008, when Russia began the process of re-equipping and reorganizing the military. The United States, on the other hand, has been in a complete peacetime environment where the sole focus of defense industry is how to make money. The purpose of Russian defense industry is how to support the national security objectives defined by the Kremlin. American defense industry is, how do we make money? How do we? And it's crazy, because the Russian budget is just a fraction of what the United States budget is, but Russia's getting a lot more bang for the dollar. In the United States, we're spending $800+ billion a year, and we're not nearly as efficient. I think one of the reasons, though, that we see this great efficiency on the part of Russia today is because the defense industry has actually been in a near warlike footing since 2008.
If we can talk a little about the expansion of the Russian army now, you've touched on it briefly, but we've seen sort of it almost come full circle. We've seen a lot of Serdyukov's reforms, quote unquote, much maligned as they are by my colleagues and myself, reversed. We've seen all of Russia's marine brigades unfolded into divisions, which is quite an interesting force structure, shall we say, mechanic, related sort of to how Russia's fleets now function as separate military districts. Sevastopol, for example, is held by the Black Sea Fleet, not by the Southern Military District. Likewise for Kaliningrad and the Baltic Fleet, and Kamchatka for the Pacific, for example. And then we are seeing the VDV, Russia's light parachutable infantry, grow to beyond what it was during the Soviet Union. The numbers, including the separate brigades, now exceed the original 6 divisions. We're seeing actual systems rolled out, the likes of which Russia has never built before. The Su-57 is actually being built in number now. We have rolled 200 T-90M tanks off the line just recently. One of, if not the most capable main battle tanks sort of on the field we're seeing now. What is this gearing up to? What are we going to see? Will this ever be deployed, or is this precautionary at the moment?
Well, again, I have to say this as somebody who's not sitting in on the Russian general staff, or I can't pick up a hotline to General Shoigu and ask these questions. So it's basically, I'm doing long distance sniping. But what I would say is this: and correct me if I'm wrong, because I'll be the first one to admit that my premise could be I could be operating on a fundamentally flawed assumption. But when Russia, for instance, has a military district, that military district is created with an objective in mind, to secure X to be able to accomplish Y, and the force structure is allocated to that district that is suitable to that task, and the budgets are set aside to that task. And so that makes it difficult to strip forces away from that district to another district, because the second you do that, you've diminished what is a standing task for this district. So yes, we've seen Eastern Military District forces deployed and such to the Special Military Operations Zone, but we haven't seen the depletion of any military district. They still retain force structures capable of accomplishing the missions that they've been given. And the Russian periphery is not a static periphery. I mean, the Arctic is a very active area because of the threat posed by NATO nations, the United States, Canada, etc., in that area. So it's not as though the Arctic's just sitting there doing nothing, saying, "Hey, why don't you take all of our forces and we'll go down there?" They have a responsibility. Japan and the Aleutian Islands and all that, that's active. That's something that Russia has to be concerned about, as with the potential of conflict in against North Korea from the United States, which would create a whole host of potential military problems that Russia needs to be prepared for, meaning they can't strip these capabilities away to support. The same thing in Central Asia. It's not as though there isn't the potential for instability there. So forces that are allocated for that area. One always has to be concerned about the Baltics and Poland. So Kaliningrad can't afford to have every one of its resources stripped away. You have Sweden and Finland now potentially joining NATO. So now you have to create this Karelian bloc, military grouping in Karelia. Again, you're creating that to deal with the Swedish-Finnish axis of threat, not to create a reserve force that could be sent down to Ukraine at a moment's notice. The exception to these appear to be the airborne forces and the marine forces. These have shown themselves to be expeditionary in nature, meaning that they can be taken away from their respective areas and deployed, and they fight very effectively. So I think, the decision by the Russians to focus on beefing up their airborne and their marine forces it indicates that that they are preparing for the potential for future need for expeditionary forces, whether it be in Ukraine or whether it be in the north, wherever. These are forces that can be taken away from their area of operation without completely diminishing the military districts. As you said, they're separate from the military district, so they can be more freely exchanged. So that's why I think that's my interpretation, is why we're seeing that kind of emphasis, because the forces that are allocated to a military district are there to accomplish a mission, and that mission isn't to be stripped away and sent to Ukraine. Whereas airborne forces and marine forces, because of their expeditionary nature, can be stripped away. And so I think that's why we're seeing a beef up, is that Russia understands that in potential conflict around its periphery, that the immediate reinforcement will come from this kind of force, the airborne forces, marine forces. And again, correct me if I'm wrong.
To circle back to a couple of points here you've made, the districts themselves, their primary purpose is managing the mobilizational potential existing there. Leningrad and Moscow were formed separately because Moscow's 15 million people imbalanced the central military district entirely too significantly. So it effectively means that they can be raised for different tasks. So you could defend Leningrad without getting the Western military district involved. Between Moscow and Leningrad, you could potentially deter a Finnish strike, for example, etc. And then with the Marines, their expeditionary nature has been curtailed slightly in recent times as the fleets have been restructured. The Russian fleets have been given their own independent air components that could be ground-based, simply by virtue of them holding the territory on which the air base is. And the Marines have been expanded in this way, from my understanding, to form the fleet's new infantry components. So, for example, if the Black Sea Fleet needs to break out of, say, the Black Sea outwards into the Med, you would deploy the Marine division associated with the fleet in the Dardanelles, for example, to guarantee crossing. Likewise for the Baltics and the Black Sea Fleet, if it needs to break out from Kronstadt into the Atlantic, you would have to deploy its marine component from Kaliningrad or from sort of the Leningrad Oblast direction. And then the Arctic is, of course, incredibly complicated. It requires all of its own machinery. The infantry has to be specially trained. And the North Fleet is more of a strategic component, really, than it is anything else. It exists almost entirely outside of the normal hierarchy for fleet command and answers effectively directly back to HQ.
Well, thank you for that.
I would like to segue now into a topic that has been much talked about in all of the information spaces, Twitter, Telegram, so on. And that is these new Western weapons that are being talked about to be delivered. The U.S. is talking about a $2.8 billion military aid package coming to Ukraine in the next couple of days. We know that this is probably going to consist of 100 Stryker armored combat vehicles and also Bradley infantry fighting vehicles. In your opinion, and I have my own opinion on this, do you believe that these weapons are going to be instantly thrown into offensive operations, or do you think that these weapons are going to be withheld and turned into new army corps in the rear of Ukraine? Because at this point, you've seen two Ukrainian armies destroyed: the pre-February army that Ukraine had and was built, and then the reconstituted army that ended up going on these offensives and is being destroyed now through attrition in Bakhmut and in the LPR area. So do you think that these weapons will be sacrificed the way that the Zelensky government has been sacrificing all of the weapons that they've been given? Or do you think that this is actually going to be built into an army in the rear to defend from whatever Russia is planning?
Well, I think the Ukrainian ideal would be to create a armored corps, multiple divisions that consists of this new equipment manned by personnel trained to task. Given all the appropriate logistics, command and control, intelligence support. Zelensky, in his interview with The Economist last fall, said that he needed 300 tanks, 500 infantry fighting vehicles, 500 artillery pieces, unlimited ammunition to carry out the task of an offensive operation that could capture the city of Melitopol, thereby severing the land bridge between Russia and Crimea and enabling Ukraine to, begin the process of rolling up the Donbass and Crimea. That's his big arrow stuff. But the reason why I bring that up is that to do that, he needed equipment that he didn't have, and he was very specific in the quantities, which implies that Ukraine's goal is to acquire a core-sized element from the West of that's comprised of tens of thousands of freshly trained troops and this newly arrived equipment. But here's the deal: each piece of equipment is going to come in on its own timeline. I know they're meeting in Ramstein right now to talk about how this equipment's going to get there, but it's coming from different national commitments. So, and each piece of equipment has its own training requirements, and that training requirement also is linked to a maintenance requirement. I think anybody who's been involved in mechanized military operations understands how intense the maintenance support requirements is for modern mechanized forces, whether it be tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, or just Strykers, wheeled vehicles. Stuff breaks, and stuff tends to break a lot in combat. And so this stuff isn't going to come in as a corps. It's not even going to come in as a battalion here, a battalion there. It's going to come in piecemeal, and it's going to be up to Ukraine to absorb it, unite it with troops, organize it, and get it prepared for whatever task it's going to be given. This is what I alluded to earlier when I said that once Russia begins its offensive operations, it needs to sustain the pressure consistently on the front, which will create the necessity for Ukraine to commit these new forces piecemeal. So even though in the aggregate they might have a armored core worth of material coming in, the real impact of it's going to be piecemeal, with a company deployed here, a battalion deployed here. I don't think they're going to have the luxury of time to even organize these forces into brigades if the Russians keep the pressure on. And so you're not going to get the mailed fist impact. You're going to get the dissipation of combat potential, which diminishes what people are hoping to accomplish by providing Ukraine with this material. But that's even in a perfect world. I personally believe that the provision of all this disparate heavy equipment is actually going to make Ukraine weaker, because the logistics support requirements that come with dealing with all these different kinds of equipment, Ukraine's not going to have the forward deployed maintenance capacity to take a broken piece of equipment that, under normal circumstances, you'd have a team come in, drop the transmission, put in a new transmission, boom, boom, bang, go. Thing breaks, it's going to have to be taken off the battlefield and shipped out of Ukraine to a depot in Poland, Germany, or elsewhere, where it'll be, repaired, and then has to be brought back in. This is just horribly complex, time-consuming, inefficient, and it's not conducive to combat effectiveness. An M2 Bradley is a competent piece of equipment if crewed properly, but it has to work as part of a system that employs combined arms. The implication being that everybody is not only trained on the equipment, but you have staffs that are adequate to the task of coordinating artillery, armor, air, etc. And that, even if you have all that, that falls apart as a unit advances, and its equipment, it just starts breaking down. Things break down in combat. They break down at a very high rate. And if you don't have the logistical ability to rapidly repair this equipment, get it back into action, you will rapidly dissipate your combat force even before you close with the opponent. So I think we're setting Ukraine up to fail, personally speaking. Unless Russia provides the kind of operational pause that gives Ukraine the ability to organize these units into larger combat formations and accumulate maintenance support, sufficient spare parts and crews capable of using these spare parts. If that happens, different story. But I think if Russia maintains this pressure, this equipment's going to come in, it's going to be thrown into the battlefield, and Ukraine's going to be ill prepared to deal with the consequences. And I think you're going to see the vast majority of this equipment, basically nullifying itself because of maintenance problems. And then whatever does make it to the forward edge of the battle area is going to be rapidly destroyed by the Russians, who are going to be organized to deal with this new threat, while the new threat's coming in a haphazard, piecemeal fashion, probably not properly coordinated. And I just think that this is going to be a giant negative for Ukraine. They're already in a deep hole, and ironically, this new infusion of billions of dollars of equipment is just going to make them weaker.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there. One more question I have: we're hearing a lot of talk about main battle tanks coming in, the Abrams, the Leopard, the Challenger. Not so much in regards to these tanks, but in the perspective of a proxy war that the U.S. is fighting. Do you see this step being the nail in the coffin or the straw on the camel's back? Because it's starting to appear that you're now getting into the main battle tanks of these countries that are going to be donated from their current armies. This is no longer Soviet era equipment being donated. These are brand new systems coming in. It appears to me that we are reaching the culmination of what the U.S. and the Western support countries can donate, and that would mean the end of a proxy. Basically, at that point, it's no longer a proxy war. It would be it's almost basically a NATO war at that point. Do you see them going over that ledge and providing those weapons that are, as you've already said, going to have terrible maintenance and logistics issues on the battlefield? Do you think that that is going to happen, and do you see that as a crucial misstep in what the proxy war was supposed to be from the start?
Well, the proxy war was designed to weaken Russia, not weaken NATO, and Russia is not weaker. I would hope anybody who is looking at this battlefield understands this. First of all, understand the gift we have given Russia, and I say this with full knowledge that Russia has suffered significant casualties, not nearly as much as the West claims, but we're talking about thousands of dead. Tens of thousands of wounded, and for the Russian people, especially the relatives, the families, it's just a crushing loss. So I don't want to minimize any of this. I understand this. I understand the impact this conflict has on the Russian economy. I don't want to make it seem like everything is roses, but the Russian military. And I think, Alex, you alluded to this earlier about certain reforms that are now being reversed. The Russian military at the start of the special military operation was somewhat moribund. I mean, it didn't have great flexibility. There was a lot of unknowns, et cetera. It looked good on paper, but did it function well in reality? Man, in the last 10 months, the Russian military has undergone tremendous revamping. Lessons have been learned, critical lessons that have been learned with the blood of Russian soldiers, with the destruction of billions of dollars of Russian equipment. These lessons have been learned. They've been, adapted. They've been incorporated. The Russian military that exists today, I believe, is orders of magnitude more lethal than the Russian military that existed, prior to the initiation of the special military operation. Russia's become stronger, more dangerous, more deadly, in terms of, combat. NATO, on the other hand, a similar problem: untested, unknown. In some cases we actually know, and we know the Germans can't fight. And I'm not picking on the individual German soldier. I'm just saying, as a military institution, they have failed to fund their military, both in terms of maintenance, and sustainability and training, so that they literally have a paper army. And yet Germany's going to start dumping Martyrs and Leopard 4s on Ukraine. So it's not like Germany's going to be bleeding off genuine combat capability. Germany is already incapable of waging large-scale ground combat in Europe, but they are going to be further weakening themselves by giving up these assets. I don't think you're going to see the M1 brought in by the United States, just because it is a completely different machine. It uses jet fuel, not diesel, not gas, and for every hour of operation, I have tankers telling me there's 3 to 4 hours of maintenance required. And again, that's sort of the Achilles heel of the Ukrainian military. The other thing I'd like to point out is, if the roles were reversed and this was the United States, and the United States was in the role of Russia, Poland would already be blown up. Ramstein wouldn't exist. We would have physically interdicted all of the logistics hubs that are involved in the flow of heavy equipment to fight our troops on the battlefield. Russia would have every right to view NATO, the United States, and any nation that's providing meaningful material support to Ukraine as an active combatant, as a participant in the conflict. This is not a proxy war. I mean, we're calling it that, but this is actually a NATO conflict against Russia. It's just that NATO troops haven't crossed in. It's NATO equipment. It's everything but the boots on the ground, which makes it a NATO war. So we're already there. It's only because of I think the maturity of the Russian government and the Russian leadership, who knows that you don't want. Look, Russia's fixed, I believe, on their objectives: demilitarization, denazification, permanent neutrality, the creation of some sort of physical buffer that can be tied into a new European security framework that will be negotiated with the West in the aftermath of Ukraine. That's the direction they're heading. They're not engaged in, we're going to roll through Ukraine, then fight Poland, then fight Romania, then move on, as many in the West fear. So Russia's not going to defeat itself by getting involved in a conflict that doesn't achieve its objectives that I've outlined. And going to war against NATO would be self-destructive for Russia. It would be Russia, would be taken off track when it comes to pursuing its ultimate goal, which is, peaceful coexistence through a new European security framework, not ongoing conflict. So Russia, I believe, has made the decision that they aren't going to allow this conflict to escalate into a direct war between Russia and NATO. The escalation management has been one of Russia's great strengths. I know it's a source of great frustration to many people who are, sympathetic to the Russian cause. It seems as though Russia's fighting with one hand tied behind its back, etc. But it's not. Russia's fighting the campaign necessary to accomplish the mission without allowing the mission to get dragged down into an expanded conflict with NATO. So I think, the West. Here's the other thing. For Russia, this is an existential struggle, meaning Russia can't lose, can't afford to lose, won't lose. The West is trying to define it as an existential struggle for the West, but that's just not the case. No matter how many times Jan Stoltenberg or others want to talk about, a Russian victory means a NATO defeat. The bottom line is a Russian victory does not mean that NATO ceases to exist or that even the NATO states have been destroyed or eliminated. It just means NATO has been yet again embarrassed by something. But this isn't an existential struggle for the West, which means there is a limit to what the West is going to do. I think you're seeing that the West is removing virtually all red lines when it comes to the provision of equipment, and Russia appears to be willing to tolerate this, meaning that they're not going to let the escalation by NATO of the provision of equipment interfere with the strategic Russian objective of denazification, demilitarization, permanent Ukrainian neutrality towards the goal of a new European security framework. But I do think that, short of some things, I don't see the United States giving Ukraine F-16s, A-10s, or M1s. There's a lot of talk about that. I don't see it happening, not because the United States doesn't want to. Ukraine simply can't absorb these technologies, not responsibly. But we see in the United States, the Patriot missile was supposed to be a red line. Couldn't do that. It'd be too provocative. We're providing, now other nations are piling on. I don't think it'll have a meaningful impact, but it's there. The Leopard tank is now on the table. You have 14 Challenger 2s. Not as though that's going to change anything except, one more piece of equipment to be maintained by a Ukrainian military that's incapable of maintaining it. But I think you're seeing the West is willing to increase the amount of equipment provided, but it's not going to, I believe, fundamentally alter ground truth in Ukraine. The Russian military is being configured to engage in sustained offensive military operations, the objective of which is to destroy the Ukrainian military. And I think Russia will accomplish this task regardless of what the West does. And so, that's just a long way of saying that I don't see Russia allowing this conflict to spin out of control. I think they are doing very smart things. For instance, allocating significant combat capability to Belarus might seem to be counterproductive if you don't intend to use that to thrust down on Kiev. And that I don't think that makes sense. But again, I'm not the one drawing arrows in the general the Russian general staff. But it does make sense if you're going to hold Poland in check, to prevent Poland from taking advantage of a collapse of the situation in Ukraine to be tempted to move into Western Ukraine. You now have sufficient force to prevent or punish Poland if it does that. That's the kind of escalation management that the Russians are engaged in. It's very responsible. It's very forward thinking, and I think it's just representative of the mature mindset of the Russian leadership, not to take the bait that's being put out there by the West, whether it's on purpose or inadvertently. But the West is creating plenty of opportunities that if Russia wanted to say, this is it, we're going to move in, we're going to punish you, we're going to expand, they legitimately could do this. But Russia's not doing that. Russia's staying focused on its principal military objectives. And because the only objective the West has is to punish Russia, to inflict pain on Russia, they're going to run out of options. I think by the time the West is ready to deliver some of the equipment they're getting ready to allocate, the Ukrainian forces that were scheduled to receive it will no longer exist. I think that Russia is going to be in the business of killing Ukrainians in large numbers, and business is going to be good.
Alex, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was just going to make a little example for our listeners on the topic that Major Ritter mentioned about sort of the improvements that the Russian army has received. To me, I think the best example of this on a micro scale is the T-72B3 pattern 2022, which uses the retired Contact 1 bricks, the smaller ones, of the very distinctive T-72B of sort of 1970s vintage. But these bricks have been placed over the mask of the weapon. The commander's pano sight now has a mechanism that retracts it, so on and so forth. And so every time a tank has been destroyed, it has been noted down. And this has served to effectively cover up any of the weaknesses. The large ERA blocks, everything between them is now covered by smaller ones. So Russia's learning, and having a blooded army is invaluable, I think.
Yeah. KSB, did you want to move on to the last topic?
Yeah. I know you have had experience working in the Middle East. Recently, I believe it was either December or November, there was a CSTO conference. And for our listeners, that is basically Russia's answer to NATO. It kind of came out as a surprise, but on the day the delegates for the conference started to arrive, a delegation from Iran arrived unannounced, and they participated in the conference as an observer. And this is not the first time that they have been invited to one of these conferences, and not the first time that they have been an observer at a CSTO event. With Benjamin Netanyahu being put back into office in Israel, with the United States continuing its line of they will use any and all means necessary to prevent Iran from getting a nuclear weapon, do you think that maybe Iran is looking more and more towards joining the CSTO as possibly a shield against military action from Israel and the United States?
I believe Iran is considering that actively. There's a lot of intransigence on the part of Iran towards joining, having a treaty relations of that nature. Iran's prided itself in its own, in its ability to defend itself. But years of economic sanctions, because it's not just with the CSTO. We also see Iran moving to establish better ties with BRICS, with Russia, with China, with the East. This pivot to the East is real. Iran is going through the same kind of transition that Russia is going through, the divorce from the West, breaking free of the intertwining of economic fabric that had taken place since the 90s in terms of Russia, but even early predating the fall of the Shah for Iran. They're breaking free of this, and they're pivoting, and that this is requiring Iran to rethink its strategic relationships. I mean, the alleged cooperation between Iran and Russia over drones is drone technology and potentially ballistic missile technology, with Russia providing Iran with advanced fighter aircraft. We're seeing a level of cooperation that was, not only hadn't existed previously, but was unimaginable a few years ago. And now it's happening at a very accelerated rate. And when you have your defense industries cooperating like that, it also implies that you have the commonality of defense strategies. You're talking about relationships, roles in the world, etc. And I think Iran is growing closer to Russia, growing closer to China economically, and as such, you're going to see. Iran's already made moves to join, or has joined the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So it's intertwined, in a decisive fashion with the economies now of this new Eurasian Economic Union that Russia and China talked about forming in February of last year. And where your economy is where your national security interests are. That's the lead. And so with now Iran's economy being redefined by economic relations with the East, it's not surprising that Iran will be looking to link itself defensively to Russia, to China, etc. So I think Iran is taking a long, hard look at the CSTO as a potential treaty relationship that could help secure its or safeguard it from being ganged up on by Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, or the United States and Israel. This Abrams Accord type relationship. So Iran is building infrastructure and relationships that are capable of withstanding that. This is all new for the Iranians. It's new territory. There are people in Iran who are opposed to this kind of thing. They feel that it actually weakens Iran. Iran has been very proud of its ability to stand on its own two legs when it comes to deterring irresponsible actions. But that was at a time when Iran continued to believe that there was hope for some sort of rapprochement between it and the West from an economic standpoint. But that is not going to be the case. And this pivot to the East, I think, has weakened the influence of the pro-Western crowd. And there's a new group of military and defense industry and even civilian leadership in Iran that are favoring this kind of close defensive alignment with Russia and others.
Well, I think that is a very decent place to end it. Scott Ritter, where can our listeners find you?
Here on your show. No.
Yeah.
Yeah. The best place is at a website, ScottRitterExtra.com. That's where anything I do, for instance, if you provide me with a link to the show, I'll be linking it there. I link all the shows that I go on, and that's where I post anything I write. I do write some exclusive material for that through a Substack that's linked to ScottRitterExtra.com. And I would encourage everybody to go. There's no paywall. It's all free. So go there and see if I add anything. I'm a big believer that nobody should be prisoner to a single source of information, but that you should avail yourself to as much information as possible in formulating your own independent opinions, analysis, and conclusions. And I interact with a lot of people like you, and I think that this ScottRitterExtra.com library is a valuable resource for people to go in there and dig deeper. Again, I encourage people to dig even deeper than that. There's other resources out there that they should take advantage of, but it's not a bad place to start.
Definitely. And also for our listeners, don't forget to check out Scott Ritter's books. He's an author, published. So get on that as well. We're going to have the links for Scott Ritter's website on the description of this podcast. So thank you, everybody, for listening. And we'll see you soon.
Thank you.